There is a check sitting on a kitchen table in the Texas Hill Country. It is made out to a man who hasn't bought a single pound of commercial feed in 12 years. It is not an inheritance. It is not a settlement. It is a Wednesday afternoon in August of 2022, and the number on that check written in the careful hand of a restaurant owner in San Antonio who drives 90 minutes each way just to shake this man's hand is $204,000. The man's name is Elroy Pruitt, and the story of how he got there begins not with genius and not with luck, but with a rusted brace of fence posts and a proposition that most men in Kerr County, Texas, would have laughed at and then promptly forgotten. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing. These are stories about people who built something real, told slowly the way they deserve to be told. Now, let's go back. The land had been in the Pruitt family since 1931, when Elroy's grandfather, a man named Calhoun Pruitt, bought 120 acres of hill country, caliche, and cedar, and whatever God had left over after finishing everything else. The price was $480. The seller thought he'd won. He hadn't been out to that particular parcel in 2 years and didn't know the creek had dried up. Calhoun knew. He bought it anyway. That was the thing about the Pruitt men. They had a long relationship with difficult land. They didn't look at a piece of ground and see what it was. They looked at it and saw what it could become given time and the right kind of attention. This was not optimism. It was something older and quieter than optimism. It was a kind of patience that the modern world has almost entirely lost the vocabulary for. Elroy was born on that land in 1948. He grew up watching his father coax grass from soil that looked like it had given up. He learned to fix things, fences, engines, water pumps, the 1,000 small mechanical systems that hold a working farm together. He married a woman named Clara in 1974. She had red hair and strong opinions about pie crust, and she died of a stroke in the spring of 2010, 8 years before any of this story's most important moments took place. The absence of her is something Elroy carries the way you carry an old injury, not always noticeable, but always there changing how you move through a room. By 2006, Elroy was 58 years old and farming alone. He had 31 goats, a loose mix of Alpine and Nubian does, 2 bucks, and a handful of kids born that spring. He sold the milk to a small cooperative that paid him a price that covered his costs on a good month and didn't on a bad one. He cut cedar for extra money in the winters. He kept a garden. He drove a 1999 Ford F250 with 211,000 miles on it, and a crack in the dashboard that had been there so long it felt like a design feature. He was not struggling in the way that makes newspapers. He was struggling in the quieter way, the way of a man who is competent and proud, and watching the margins of his life grow slowly thinner year by year, without any single moment he could point to and call the problem. On his kitchen table, next to the salt and a coffee mug that said "Property of no one," sat a small brass balance scale. It had belonged to his mother, who had used it to weigh flour and butter in the days before digital kitchen scales were common. 2 shallow copper pans suspended from a central beam by thin chains. When both sides were empty, the beam rested level. When something was placed on one side, it dipped and kept dipping until you added enough weight to the other side to bring it back. Elroy used it to weigh the small wheels of fresh cheese he had begun making from his goat's milk. He'd started doing it because Clara had done it years ago with milk they bought from a neighbor. He kept doing it after she died because the process required the kind of attention that left no room for other thoughts. You couldn't be somewhere else in your mind while you were tending a culture. The bacteria didn't care about your grief. He was not at this point a cheesemaker in any serious sense. He was an old man making cheese for himself and occasionally for the families at his church who received it with the polite enthusiasm of people who did not know quite what they were receiving. The brass scale sat on the table, the beam rested level, the two empty pans swayed very gently whenever someone walked past. The Lone Star Creamery had been in Kerrville since 1994. It was not a glamorous operation. It occupied a long metal building on the south end of town that smelled, depending on the wind and the season, of warm milk or of something just slightly past warm milk. They made blocks of Colby and Monterey Jack that ended up in grocery stores under 3 or 4 different private labels, and they were good at it in the way that competent, unambitious manufacturing is good at things consistent, reliable, unremarkable. The byproduct of making cheese is whey. If you have never thought about whey, you are in the company of most of the people who eat cheese regularly and contentedly without any awareness of what happens on the other side of the process. After the milk is curdled and the curds are pressed and formed, what remains is a thin, slightly yellowish liquid, mildly sweet, rich in protein and calcium and lactose, and a particular kind of useful bacteria that has no interest in being useful to a creamery trying to run a clean operation. Whey goes bad fast. It attracts flies. In volume, it generates enough biological activity to violate county waste ordinances if it sits long enough in the heat. For a small industrial creamery producing 40,000 pounds of cheese a month, whey was not a product. It was a problem. In 2006, that problem was costing the Lone Star Creamery approximately $600 a week in disposal fees, which worked out to just over $30,000 a year. This was not money the creamery could easily absorb. The margins on private label commodity cheese were not wide. Harold Fenwick, the creamery's general manager, a heavy-set man from Comfort, Texas, who had been in the dairy business his entire adult life and had the permanently worried expression to prove it was looking for a cheaper solution. He knew Elroy Pruitt the way everyone in Kerr County knew everyone else, not intimately, but with a long familiarity built on years of waving from truck windows and standing next to each other at the feed store and knowing each other's family histories the way you know the words to a song you've heard 1,000 times without ever choosing to learn it. He knew Elroy had goats. He knew whey was in sufficient quantity, a decent dietary supplement for ruminants. It added protein. It was digestible. It was essentially free nutrition if you could move it efficiently. He drove out to the Pruitt place on a Tuesday morning in March of 2006, just after the cedar pollen had started to settle and the live oaks were pushing out their small spring leaves. Elroy was in the equipment shed, realigning the blade on a brush hog with the focused patience of a man who had done this particular job 40 times and still gave it his full attention. Harold explained the situation without preamble: the whey, the cost, the twice-weekly volume. He proposed that the creamery run a 2-inch flexible pipe to a storage tank on Elroy's property. They'd pay for the tank and the line and pump the whey over free of charge twice a week. Elroy wouldn't pay for it. The creamery Wouldn't charge for disposal. Mutual benefit. Handshake. Elroy set down his wrench. He stood for a moment, looking at the cedar ridge to the west where the land rose and the soil got thinner and the rocks pushed through the ground like the bones of something old and enormous just beneath the surface. "I'll take it," he said. Harold nodded, relieved in the way of a man who had prepared arguments he did not have to use. "I figured you'd feed it to the goats," Harold said. Elroy picked up his wrench. "Maybe," he said. "He did not feed it to the goats." This is the first thing you need to understand about Elroy Pruitt, and it is the thing that separates him from every other farmer in Kerr County who might have taken the same handshake deal and done the obvious thing with it. He did not do the obvious thing. He did not do any particular thing at first. He watched. The Whey arrived for the first time on a Friday morning in April of 2006, pumped through the new line into a 500-gallon polyethylene tank the Creamery had installed at the edge of his property. Elroy walked out to it that afternoon, opened the valve at the bottom, and let a gallon of it run out into his hand. He smelled it, tasted it, looked at it in the afternoon light. He walked the fence line of the pasture where his goats grazed, looking at the ground. Hill country soil is caliche-heavy, pale, alkaline, compacted. It does not absorb water quickly. It does not hold nutrients. Good grass grows in it despite its nature, not because of it. The cedar and the scrub oak have adapted to it over thousands of years. But agricultural grass, the kind that feeds animals well, is always fighting the soil chemistry. Elroy had been fighting that chemistry his entire life. He had tried lime, he had tried different grass varieties, he had spent money he did not have on things that made the extension office pamphlets sound promising and the actual ground remain stubbornly indifferent. He went to the library in Kerrville that weekend. Not the internet. Elroy did not own a computer and had no particular interest in acquiring one. He went to the library and asked the librarian, a woman named Mrs. Petrov, who had been there since 1989 and knew where everything was, for anything she had on soil amendment and dairy byproduct application. She found him 3 things: a 1974 USD A Agricultural Bulletin, a 1988 paper from Texas A&M on Whey land application for rangeland restoration, and a thin photocopied document from a cheese cooperative in Vermont that someone had donated to the collection years ago. Elroy sat at the library table for 4 hours. He took notes in a pocket notebook with a mechanical pencil. The notes were precise. He wrote down pH values and nitrogen content and bacterial counts and infiltration rates. He wrote down the failures other people had documented, the times Whey application had gone wrong, had acidified soil, had attracted pests, had created runoff problems. He wrote these down first, before he wrote down anything about success. This was his method. Understand the ways something can fail before you invest in hoping it will succeed. He drove home. He made dinner. He sat at the kitchen table with the brass scale and a glass of iced tea and thought for a long time. Then he went to the equipment shed and came back with a 5-gallon plastic bucket. What Elroy did next would look to any observer like the behavior of an eccentric old man who didn't quite understand what Whey was for. He diluted it 3 parts water to 1 part Whey based on the Texas A&M paper's recommendations for initial application rates on alkaline soils. He carried that bucket to the far corner of his west pasture, where the soil was worst, where even the buffalo grass grew sparse and yellow-tipped, and he poured it out in a slow circle, the way you'd water a tree. He marked the spot with a cedar stake. He did this 3 times a week for the rest of April. He kept notes. In the pocket notebook, then in the first of what would become a long series of green and white columnar ledgers, the old-fashioned kind, the kind his father had used for the farm's accounts. He recorded the date, the volume applied, the dilution ratio, the weather, the soil moisture before and after. He crouched down every few days and looked at the dirt up close, the way a doctor looks at something through a lens patient, and unrushed. In May, he expanded to 3 spots, each one a slightly different dilution, each one marked with a stake and a number burned into the wood with a soldering iron. By June, the grass at stake number 1, the original spot. The 3-to-1 dilution was 3 inches taller than the surrounding pasture and a different shade of green, darker, more saturated. The difference was not dramatic, but it was undeniable, and Elroy was the kind of man who trusted undeniable over dramatic every single time. He told no one. He kept pouring. By the fall of 2006, he had mapped out a rotation system for the entire west pasture, 40 acres of the most difficult ground on his property, the stretch that ran toward the cedar ridge where the caliche was deepest. The goats were grazing it in sections, and the sections he had been treating with diluted whey were recovering from grazing faster than the sections he hadn't. Not faster in a way that would make anyone stop their truck on the road and stare. Faster in the way that only becomes visible when you're watching the same patch of ground day after day, season after season, with the particular attention of someone who has decided this matters. The brass scale on his kitchen table. He started using it differently now, not just for cheese. He would bring in small soil samples from different test spots, weigh them dry, soak them, weigh them again, measuring water retention, 2 pans, the beam dipping and finding its level. He filled page after page of the ledger with numbers that no one would have understood without the context of standing in his pasture and watching what those numbers corresponded to in the actual ground. He also, during these months, got better at making cheese. He had a 1987 copy of a cheese-making manual that he'd found at an estate sale years ago, its spine cracked and several pages stuck together with what appeared to be ancient brine. He followed it with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. He failed regularly. A batch of chèvre in November of 2006 developed a smell he could only describe as aggressive. A hard cheese he attempted that winter came out with a texture like compressed sawdust. He wrote both failures down in the ledger, not with frustration, but with the flat descriptive accuracy of a field scientist. Culture temperature too high, press weight insufficient, note for next attempt. In the spring of 2007, his Nubian does, who were now grazing the improved pasture sections more than the unimproved ones by their own preference, began producing milk with a higher butterfat content. Elroy measured it the old way with a simple cream separator and the brass scale and a notebook. He ran the numbers 3 times because the first 2 times he thought he'd made an arithmetic error. He hadn't. The grass was different. The grass was different because the soil was different. And the milk was different because the grass was different. the whole chain of connection, living and specific, running from the whey in the tank to the ground, to the roots, to the blades, to the rumens of the goats, to the milk that came warm and white and increasingly extraordinary into the stainless steel pails every morning. This is what Elroy understood that Harold Fenwick had not understood when he made his offer, and that no one at the Creamery would have understood if you had tried to explain it to them. The whey was not a dietary supplement. It was not an input to be consumed. It was a building material. Elroy was using it to build something that didn't show up on any ledger line, not his, not the Creamery's. He was building the productivity of the land itself. The years moved, the way years move on a working farm, not slowly exactly, but with a density of event that makes each one feel full. 2007, 2008. The pasture expanded in its greenness, the circle of treated ground growing year by year as Elroy refined his dilutions and his rotation schedule. 2009, his herd grew to 50 goats. His cheese improved to the point where the church families stopped being politely enthusiastic and became genuinely so, the kind of enthusiasm that results in phone calls asking if there was any more of that aged one with the herbs. Clara died in May, and Elroy missed a week of his records, the only gap in the ledger that year. Then he went back. The goats still needed water. The test plots still needed monitoring. The world did not pause for grief, and there was something almost merciful in that. Elroy's daughter Nadine came home for the first time in 4 years. She was 41 years old then, an architect in Austin, good at her work, the kind of organized intelligence that expresses itself in clean lines and precise measurements, and a deep discomfort with things that cannot be quantified. She had her mother's stubbornness and her father's patience in everything except when it came to her father, with whom the patience had been running on empty for years over a disagreement that had happened in 2002, a developer from San Antonio who had offered Elroy $600,000 for the back 40 acres near the creek. Elroy had turned him down. Nadine had thought he was throwing away her future and his own. The silence between them had been growing ever since, like a slow crack in a load-bearing wall. She stood in the west pasture in the late afternoon of a September day, watching her father draw whey from the storage tank in a 5-gallon bucket, diluted from the hose at the side of the tank, and carry it out to the nearest test plot. "What are you doing tending the ground?" "That's Creamery waste." Elroy set the bucket down, poured it in a slow arc, watched it sink into the soil. "Used to be." She stood there in her clean Austin clothes and looked at what her father had made, the patchwork of green against pale, the cedar stakes still marking the oldest plots, now covered with grass, so thick the stakes were almost invisible in it. She looked at the bucket. She looked at her father's face, which told her nothing, because it never told her anything she hadn't already decided she was looking for. "Bah!" She said a word she'd stopped using somewhere in her 20s, the old familiar word surfacing now from somewhere old. "This looks like a waste disposal site." Elroy picked up his bucket. "Come back in 5 years." She didn't. She came back to fight about selling the creek parcel again, and they said things to each other that were honest and therefore permanent. And she drove back to Austin in the dark, and the silence between them grew another ring, like a tree marking a hard year. Elroy went inside. He sat at the kitchen table. He opened the ledger. He made his entry for the day, in the same mechanical pencil, in the same small careful hand. Then he looked at the brass scale on the corner of the table for a long time, the two empty pans, the beam resting level. He went to bed. The years kept coming, 2012, 2013. Elroy's reputation for his cheese had grown in the small organic way that reputations grow in rural Texas. A jar passed hand to hand, a name mentioned at a dinner party, a rancher's wife who drove 20 minutes out of her way to stop at the farm on a Saturday morning. He was selling to perhaps 8 families on a regular basis by 2013. His gross income from cheese that year was $11,000. He was still selling milk to the cooperative. He was still cutting cedar in the winters. But the land was changing in a way that was becoming hard to ignore, even if you'd never heard of Elroy Pruitt and didn't know to look for it. The west pasture was greener, denser, more resilient. After a drought year that turned most of the hill country the color of old paper, Elroy's treated sections came back faster, held more moisture, fed more goats per acre than anything his neighbors were running. Nobody asked him how. He didn't offer to explain. In the spring of 2018, his grandson Beck arrived. Beckett Pruitt was 24 years old and had spent 2 years in community college studying marketing before deciding that what he was really studying was how to avoid deciding what to do next. He was not lazy. He had an active, searching mind that had simply not yet found anything worth latching onto. He had his grandfather's coloring dark hair, going lighter at the temples, early the kind of build that looked like it was made for outdoor work, even when it was currently doing no outdoor work at all. He came with one bag and the vague notion of staying a month. He stayed because of what he saw in the first week. He saw an old man who was 70 years old and moved with a deliberateness that looked slow until you started tracking what he actually accomplished in a day, which was considerable. He saw 58 goats who were, even to Beck's untrained eye, unusually healthy, bright-eyed, well-muscled, with the particular composure of animals that are not stressed. He saw pasture land that looked genuinely different from the surrounding hill country green, where the neighbors were yellow lush, where the country was spare. And he saw the ledgers. 12 of them stacked on the shelf above the roll-top desk in the small back office that smelled of old paper and the cedar pencil shavings Elroy had been dropping in a dish there since before Beck was born. 12 volumes of careful notation, 12 years of inputs and outputs and failures and adjustments, and the slow, patient accumulation of a knowledge that lived nowhere else in the world. Beck pulled one off the shelf, the third one from 2008, and sat down and read it the way you'd read a novel if the novel were written in data. Elroy came in from the barn and saw his grandson sitting in the desk chair, the ledger open across his knees. He said nothing. He went to the kitchen and put on coffee. Beck worked the farm that summer without being asked to. He learned the rhythms because they were impossible not to learn if you were present for them, the morning milking at 5:30, the grazing rotation, the cheese days on Tuesdays and Fridays, the twice-weekly arrival of the Whey from the Creamery. He watched Elroy carry the diluted Whey out to the pasture with a focused attention that Beck recognized eventually as the same attention Elroy gave to everything on the farm. Not love, exactly, not obsession, something in between, something older than both. In August of that summer, Beck made a mistake. He borrowed Elroy's phone, the old clamshell Nokia, the one that still worked, because Elroy treated everything he owned as if it had to last a generation to call a friend, and while he had it in his hand, he took 3 photographs. Elroy carrying the bucket toward the pasture, his silhouette against the late afternoon light, the cedar ridge behind him. A close-up of the brass scale on the kitchen table, a small wheel of goat cheese on one pan, the beam tipped in its measurement. The east pasture with the goats grazing in their grouped, unhurried way against the hill country backdrop. He did not intend to post them. He posted them to his own account out of habit, with no caption except the tag of the county, and went to sleep. He woke to 47 notifications. The photographs had been shared by a food blogger in Austin who had 200,000 followers and a particular reverence for what she called the aesthetics of real work. She had shared the photo of Elroy with the caption, "This is what it looks like to know something." In 36 hours, the photographs had been seen by 14,000 people. The phone Elroy's Nokia had received 11 text messages, 4 voicemails, and 2 missed calls from a number Beck traced back to a restaurant in Fredericksburg. Beck showed Elroy the screen. Elroy looked at it for a moment. "What do they want?" "Your cheese." Elroy handed the phone back. "Then tell them they can come get it." A woman named Rosalind Vickers drove out from Fredericksburg on a Wednesday morning. She was 36, the head chef at a restaurant called The Broken Wheel that had been written about in the Austin Chronicle and the Houston Press, and that ran a menu built around the specific and the local. She drove a 10-year-old Subaru with a child seat in the back and a Texas Farm Bureau sticker on the bumper. She did not call ahead. She pulled up the gravel drive and found Elroy in the small converted shed he used as a cheese cave, a room he kept at 55 degrees with a window unit cooler and a humidity tray lined with rough cedar shelves holding perhaps 24 small wheels and rounds in various stages of aging. The smell of the room was specific and layered, and not unpleasant, lactic and earthy and faintly sweet, with something underneath that she identified after a moment as the particular character of the land outside. She asked if she could taste something. Elroy handed her a piece of the aged hard cheese, the one he'd been making variations of since 2009, and had quietly decided was the best thing he'd made. It was pale yellow firm, with a texture that yielded and a flavor that built slowly, first clean and milky, then grassy, then something mineral and dry that she recognized as the taste of the local cedar and the particular limestone character of hill country water. She chewed it slowly. She looked at the cheese in her hand. She looked at Elroy. "What do your goats eat?" "Grass, whey from the Creamery, what they can find." "Which pasture?" "The west one mostly. I've been working that ground for 12 years. She looked out the small window of the cheese cave at the pasture in question, green and dense against the dry cedar ridge behind it. "This cheese tastes like this county," she said. "This exact part of it." Elroy nodded once. "It should." Rosalind Vickers ordered 180 pounds a month beginning immediately. She wanted all varieties he could make. She would send someone to pick it up twice a month. She named a price not by the pound, but by the wheel that Elroy ran through the math on later that evening at the kitchen table, with the brass scale sitting at its usual corner and the ledger open and the mechanical pencil in his hand. He ran the math twice. Then he sat for a long time without writing anything. £180 a month from one buyer alone was more than his current herd could reliably produce. He would need to expand more, thus more grazing capacity, which meant more pasture improvement, which meant more whey, more time, more rotation. He would need to let the system grow in the careful incremental way he had always let it grow, because the other way, the fast way, the way of acquiring more animals than the land was ready to hold, was the way that damaged the land and degraded the product and ultimately collapsed under its own ambition. He had seen that happen to other farms, good farms that had grown too fast and lost the thing that made them worth growing. He opened the first ledger, the one from 2006, the year the Whey tank was installed. He turned to the first page, the one where he'd recorded those initial applications in the corner of the west pasture, the 5-gallon bucket, the cedar stakes, the small, careful entries. The brass scale on the table, one pan empty, one holding a small wheel of cheese, no bigger than his 2 fists pressed together, the beam tilting down, then finding the balance point, then holding there. He turned to the back of the new ledger to a clean page and began to write. He wrote what he would need, what the land could give, what the timeline would look like. He wrote the name Rosalind Vickers and her restaurant and the agreed monthly order. He wrote in the same small hand he had used to record 12 years of failures and adjustments, the beginning of something larger than what he had built. He did not know that evening in the cheese cave's shadow, with the hill country going dark outside his window, that the system he had built so carefully, so slowly, so rooted in the specific nature of this particular 120 acres of difficult Texas ground, was about to meet the thing it had not been built to withstand. He did not know that the man who was about to walk through his gate would look at what he had made and see not a system but a resource, not a partnership but an inefficiency, not a covenant but a line item. He would learn those things soon enough. For now, he closed the ledger. He put the mechanical pencil in the crease of the spine the way he always did. He looked at the brass scale one more time, the cheese on one pan, the counterweight he'd found for it in a kitchen drawer years ago on the other, the beam resting in its perfect patient level. Then he went inside to make dinner. The hill country went dark. The goats settled in their pasture. The Whey tank stood at the fence line full and waiting for morning. And for the last time in a long time, everything was in balance. The first delivery for Rosalind Vickers went out on a Tuesday morning in September of 2018. Beck loaded the wheels into a cooler lined with dish towels. They didn't have proper cheese transport boxes yet, didn't have any of the things a real operation would have, and drove the 40 minutes to Fredericksburg in Elroy's F25, oh, the one with the cracked dashboard, because his own car had a slow leak in the rear left tire that he hadn't gotten around to fixing. He pulled up to the back entrance of the Broken Wheel at 8 in the morning and stood there holding a cooler full of his grandfather's cheese, like a man who had not entirely thought through what came next. The sous chef who opened the door was 22 and wearing a clean white apron, and looked at Beck the way people look at things that don't quite fit the category they're expecting. Pruitt Farm. Yeah. Chef Vickers said to weigh everything in and give you a receipt. Beck nodded like this was information he had anticipated. He had not anticipated any of it. He had not anticipated that restaurants had receiving procedures, that cheese needed to be logged by weight and variety, that there would be paperwork. He stood at a stainless steel table in the back of a professional kitchen and watched a 22-year-old weigh his grandfather's cheese on a digital scale with practiced efficiency, and felt for the first time the distance between what he'd built in his head and what actually existed. They drove home mostly in silence, Beck and the cooler, now empty, rattling in the back. The second delivery, 2 weeks later, Beck brought a proper receipt book. He found it at the pharmacy in Kerrville, the kind with carbon copies, the kind that restaurants had stopped using 15 years ago. Rosalind's sous chef looked at it without expression and handed Beck a proper invoice template printed from the restaurant's system instead. Use this going forward. Beck used it. The learning happened in that mode, not in insights, but in adjustments, not in plans, but in the gradual acquisition of competence through the specific texture of being wrong about small things in front of people who were not wrong about them. He built the website over 3 evenings at the kitchen table, working on his laptop while Elroy read. It was a single page, the farm's name, a photograph of the pasture, a photograph of the cheese cave, a contact form. He was proud of it for approximately 4 days, until he looked at it again and saw that the font was wrong, the layout was static, and the contact form sent submissions to an email address he had not checked in 6 months. He fixed it, then fixed it again. Elroy watched all of this with an expression that Beck could not fully interpret. Not skepticism, not encouragement. The same steady measuring attention he brought to the pasture in the early mornings, the look of a man noting what is happening without yet deciding what it means. By November, Beck had added 3 more restaurant accounts. Not through any formal sales process. He had no formal sales process, but through Rosalind, who mentioned the farm to 2 other chefs in the way that serious cooks share discoveries with a specificity that carries more weight than any advertisement. A small bistro in Fredericksburg. A farm-to-table place in Comfort that seated 30 people and had a 6-week reservation wait. A wine bar in Kerrville that had recently hired a new chef who was trying to build a local sourcing program and needed exactly the kind of ingredient that had a story attached to it. The story was, it turned out, doing significant work. Beck had not manufactured the story. He had simply written it down on the website in a short paragraph in the plain language of someone who had read the ledgers and understood what they contained. The Whey from the Creamery, the 12 years of soil work, the brass scale, the way the cheese tasted like the specific county it came from. He wrote it the way his grandfather kept records, without embellishment, without rhetoric, with the plain confidence of a man describing something that is simply true. People responded to it the way people respond to things that are simply true, which is to say, with a disproportionate emotion that surprises them and that they are eager to share. By December, the farm was moving 400 pounds of cheese a month. Elroy had expanded the herd to 71 goats and was running the west pasture at full rotation, the improvements layered over 12 years, visible now in the consistency of the forage through what had been a dry fall, the treated sections holding their moisture, the goats coming off the rotated sections with the full rounded condition of animals that were eating well. The money was real now in a way it hadn't been before. Not comfortable, they were still running lean, still absorbing the cost of the herd expansion, still driving the cracked dashboard truck, but real. Beck opened a separate business account at the local bank and began keeping books the way his grandfather kept field notes, dated, precise, comprehensive. He put the column ledgers beside Elroy's on the shelf above the roll-top desk. His were thinner. They would fill. The Whey kept coming. Twice a week, the Creamery's line pressurized and the tank at the fence line filled. Elroy made his entries. The system moved. In the spring of 2019, a man named Dub Castleberry, who ran a small barley operation 12 miles north near Center Point, left 2 50-pound bags of malted barley at Elroy's gate with a note that said only, "Herd the goats like a little grain supplement. This is extra from last year's run. No charge." Elroy didn't know Dub well. They had spoken twice, both times at the Kerrville Farm Bureau annual meeting, both times briefly. He wrote Dub a thank you note on plain white paper in his careful hand and mailed it. 2 weeks later, a woman from the Methodist Church left a box of windfall peaches from her orchard, the ones too bruised for selling, at the same gate. No note. The goats ate them in 40 minutes with evident enthusiasm, and the milk, the following week, had a faint sweetness that Elroy noted in the ledger and that showed up faintly in a fresh chèvre he made that Friday. He noted that too. The community was not organizing itself around the farm. Nothing so deliberate was happening, but something was the slow, unannounced recognition of something worth recognizing, expressed in the way rural communities have always expressed such things, not with ceremony, but with small, tangible offerings left at gates, with recommendations made across fences, with the particular local loyalty that attaches to a thing that is genuinely and unmistakably from here. Elroy accepted every offering with the same note, same hand, same mailing. He kept a list of who had given what in the ledger, because this too was a kind of accounting. Marcus Delworth arrived on a Monday in March of 2019. He drove a silver Ford F1 50 King Ranch edition that had been washed recently and probably often. He was 38 and wore a Carhartt jacket that was too new to have been worn in the field, and carried a tablet in a leather case. He shook Elroy's hand with the firm, brief grip of a man who has been told that handshakes communicate character and has practiced accordingly. He explained who he was. The Creamery had been acquired by Tundra Food Group, a Dallas-based beverage and dairy conglomerate, in January. Marcus was the new director of operations. He was reviewing all of the facility's existing agreements and relationships as part of a comprehensive onboarding process. Elroy stood in the drive and listened. Marcus explained that the Whey arrangement had come to his attention during the review. It was informal. There was no contract, no insurance rider, no liability protection for either party. As a first step, he'd like to formalize it, standard language, 60-day termination clause, on either side indemnification for the Creamery in case of any issues with the Whey application on Elroy's property. "Harold and I had an understanding," Elroy said. "I'm aware, but Harold is retired, and an understanding isn't a document." "Worked for 13 years?" "It did," Marcus said, and he had the grace to mean it, at least in that moment. "I'm not here to end anything. I just want to make sure we're protected properly." Elroy looked at him for a moment. The tablet in its leather case, the unworn jacket, the washed truck. "Send me what you want signed. I'll look at it." Marcus nodded, made a note on the tablet, shook Elroy's hand again. He drove away on the clean gravel with the particular confidence of a man who believes that the meeting has gone well because no one said no. Elroy went inside and told Beck what had happened. Beck looked up from the laptop. "Do we need a lawyer? Read what he sends first." The document arrived 3 days later by email, forwarded to Beck's account, since Elroy had no email. It was 4 pages of standard commercial language, the kind generated by a template specific to nothing about this particular situation. Beck read it twice, then drove to Kerrville and sat for an hour with a general practice attorney named Hallie Dunmore, whose office was above the hardware store and who charged $150 for a consultation. She read the document in 12 minutes. "It's fine," she said. "A little one-sided on the indemnification, but nothing alarming. 60-day termination clause is standard. Either party can exit." She paused. "The thing I'd add is a right of first refusal clause if they ever decide to charge for the whey or sell it elsewhere. You get the option to match the price." Beck had not thought of this. He drove home and told Elroy. Elroy was quiet for a moment, then added. Beck emailed Marcus with the requested amendment. Marcus replied the same afternoon the right of first refusal was agreeable subject to a modification that capped the period to 30 days rather than 60. Beck accepted. The contract was signed. The handshake that Harold and Elroy had kept for 13 years was now 4 pages of text in a filing cabinet, and it felt like something had been both gained and lost, though neither Beck nor Elroy could have said precisely what. The whey kept coming. The farm kept growing. By the fall of 2019, the Pruitt farm operation was grossing $74,000 a year. It was by any conventional measure a genuine small business success, local, specific, well-regarded, growing at a rate the land could support. Beck had taken on the full management of the commercial side, invoicing, delivery, scheduling, customer relationships, the website, which was now considerably better than it had been. He had declined 2 job offers from marketing agencies in Austin without fully registering that he had declined them until weeks later, when the emails had gone unanswered long enough that the window had closed. He had not consciously decided to stay. He had simply kept not leaving, and after a certain point, the distinction stops mattering. He was 25, then 26. He learned things he had not known. He would need to know how to read a milk quality report, how to maintain the aging temperature in the cheese cave through a Texas summer, how to talk to a restaurant about a delivery delay without losing the account. He learned how to read the ledgers, not just the numbers, but the shape of them, the way years of entries built into patterns that told you something the individual entries didn't. He found a page in the third ledger from 2008 that he kept returning to. It was a list. Elroy had titled it in the sparse way he titled everything what didn't work. Below it, a column of failures, batch numbers, dates, brief clinical descriptions. Chèvre culture, contaminated batch 14. Hard cheese, insufficient brine concentration wheels, 7 to 9. West plot, 3 acidification, reduced application for 60 days. On and on, a full page of things that had not worked, each one noted with the same flat precision as the things that had. No frustration visible, no drama. At the bottom of the page, in slightly smaller writing, as if added later, soil doesn't lie. Just have to listen long enough. Beck photographed the page on his phone and kept the photograph in an album he had labeled, without being entirely sure why, Foundation. The thing arrived in the spring of 2020 that no one's plans had accounted for. The pandemic shut the restaurants in March. Not all at once, in stages, mandates shifting by county and by week, but the effect on the farm's revenue was immediate and nearly total. 6 accounts paused orders. Within 10 days, 2 more followed. Rosalind Vickers called Beck personally on a Thursday evening. "I'm so sorry. We're doing curbside, only the margins are impossible. I have to pause everything that isn't essential inventory." "I understand." Beck, a pause. "The cheese is extraordinary. This is not a quality conversation." "I know." He sat at the kitchen table after he hung up and looked at the numbers. 74,000 a year had become in the space of 2 weeks approximately 16,000 a year from the 3 accounts that were still operating. They had reserves. Elroy had always kept reserves. It was in the ledger philosophy. You kept 3 months of operating costs in a savings account, the same way you kept 3 months of hay in the barn, but the reserves were not unlimited. Elroy came in from the barn, poured himself coffee, sat across from Beck. Beck showed him the numbers. Elroy looked at them. He drank his coffee. He said, "What can we sell that isn't restaurants?" It was the right question. It was the only question. Beck spent 4 days restructuring the business. He built an online ordering system properly this time, with a real e-commerce platform for direct-to-consumer sales. He contacted the 2 grocery stores in Kerrville about carrying the cheese. He reached out to a small specialty food distributor in San Antonio who had emailed the farm twice in 2019 and been told they weren't ready for distribution yet. They were ready now. Dub Castleberry, the barley farmer from Center Point, heard through the county grapevine that the Pruitt farm was having a hard season. He called Beck on a Sunday morning. "I got a farmer's market booth. I'm not using over in Comfort on Saturdays. You want it no charge." Beck drove to Comfort the following Saturday with 2 coolers, a folding table, and a handmade sign that said Pruitt Farm, Kerrville, in black marker on white cardboard. He sold out of everything he brought in 3 hours. The following Saturday, he brought twice as much, sold out in 2.5. By June of 2020, the direct sales channel was generating more revenue per pound than the restaurant accounts had. No middlemen, no delivery logistics. Customers who drove to Comfort or ordered online were paying retail prices for something they had decided they wanted specifically, which meant they were customers who didn't leave when the next convenient option appeared. The farm came through the year, not easily, not without the reserves being touched, but through. When the restaurants reopened in 2021 and Rosalind Vickers called to restart her account, Beck told her the farm had restructured its pricing. The new rate was 12% higher than the old one. There was a silence on the phone that lasted long enough for Beck to understand it could go either direction. "Okay," Rosalind said. "When can we get the first delivery?" Elroy turned 73 in March of 2021. He moved more slowly than he had in 2018, not worryingly so, not in any way that announced itself as a problem, but Beck noticed the afternoons when his grandfather sat on the porch for an hour before going back out to the barn, which he had not done before. He noticed that Elroy occasionally left a ledger entry unfinished and completed it the following morning, which he also had not done before. He did not raise this with Elroy. He began quietly learning things that Elroy had always handled himself: the maintenance schedule for the aging room refrigeration unit, the annual trim and hoof check rotation for the herd, the specific dilution ratios for the different pasture sections that Elroy had never written down, because they lived in his hands in the particular feel of the soil and the particular look of the grass. Beck wrote them down. He added pages to his own ledger. He did not tell Elroy he was doing this. He thought Elroy probably knew. In July of 2021, on a Tuesday morning that was already 94 degrees at 8 a.m., with the hill country baking in a drought that had been building since April, Marcus Delworth drove up the gravel lane for the second time. He was not alone. A woman in a business suit sat in the passenger seat. She got out and stood by the truck, holding a leather portfolio and looking at the farm with the evaluating expression of someone who has been sent to evaluate something. Elroy was in the cheese cave running the morning check. Beck was in the equipment shed, which was what he was doing when he heard the truck on the gravel and came out. Marcus shook Beck's hand, introduced the woman, Sandra Pitts, Tundra Food Group's Regional Resource Analyst, which was a title that Beck absorbed and found ominous, without being able to immediately explain why. "Is your grandfather available?" "He's working. What do you need?" Marcus looked at the equipment shed, at the goats, visible in the far pasture, at the cheese cave, at the storage tank, by the fence line. "We've had a development," he said. "I wanted to discuss it in person." Beck went to get Elroy. They stood in the shade of the equipment shed, all four of them, and Marcus explained. A company called BioNourish, based in Houston, had approached Tundra Food Group about purchasing whey concentrate from the Creamery for use in athletic nutrition products. The volume they wanted was significant. The price they were offering was $45 per ton for raw whey. The Creamery was currently producing approximately 22 tons of whey per week. Sandra Pitts, who had not yet spoken, opened her leather portfolio. Elroy looked at the numbers. He didn't look at Sandra Pitts. "We're honoring the right of first refusal clause," Marcus said, and he sounded for a moment almost apologetic. "We're obligated to offer you the same price before we sign with BioNourish, $45 per ton." Beck did the math while Marcus was still speaking. 22 tons a week, 52 weeks, $45 per ton. It was over $50,000 a year. He looked at his grandfather. Elroy was quiet for a long time. A long particular time, the kind of silence that has something working behind it, something the silence is making room for. "I can't pay $45 a ton," Elroy said. "It's the same price BioNourish is offering." "I understand what it is." Marcus nodded slowly. Sandra Pitts wrote something in her portfolio. "The contract has a 30-day right of first refusal window," Marcus said. "We'd need your decision by the 15th. Elroy nodded once. Marcus and Sandra Pitts got into the truck and drove down the gravel lane and turned onto the county road and were gone. Beck stood in the shade of the equipment shed and watched the dust settle. "Pop!" Elroy was looking at the whey tank at the fence line at the cedar ridge beyond. "How much whey do we need a week?" he asked. Beck knew the number. He had been keeping the books. Somewhere between 8 and 10 tons for the current herd, more if we expand the way we've been planning. And where would we get it if not from them? This was the question. Beck had been turning it over since Marcus started talking, looking for the shape of an answer. The hill country had dairy cattle operations, not many, not large ones, but a few. Bison ranches. There was a small organic yogurt operation near Fredericksburg that produced buttermilk whey as a byproduct. None of them in the volume the Creamery provided, but collectively possibly, if you were willing to manage multiple sources and build the relationships. He had been thinking about this, he realized, for longer than today. Some part of him had been turning over the question of dependency for the better part of a year without having named it as a question. We could source it from other places, Beck said. It would take time. It wouldn't be the same volume right away. How long? Beck thought carefully. 6 months, maybe 8, if everything worked. Elroy turned toward the house. Come inside. They sat at the kitchen table, the brass scale on its corner, the beam level, the 2 copper pans catching the morning light. Elroy pulled his current ledger from the shelf above the desk and opened it to a page Beck had not seen. It was a list of names, 6 of them. Farmers in the surrounding area. Dub Castleberry was third on the list. Each name had a number next to it, an estimated weekly whey or whey equivalent volume, a note about what their operation produced and when the byproduct was typically available. Beck stared at the list. When did you write this? Elroy looked at the page. February. 4 months ago, before Marcus arrived, before BioNourish, before any of today's conversation had any reason to happen. Beck looked at his grandfather. Elroy did not look like a man who had been vindicated. He looked like a man who had done a calculation and written it down the way he did all calculations. You knew, Beck said. I didn't know. I thought about what could happen. That's different. The 30-day window opened. Beck started making calls the next morning. Dub Castleberry said yes before Beck finished explaining what he needed. The yogurt operation in Fredericksburg, run by a woman named Petra Hunsaker, who had been making organic yogurt in the hill country for 11 years and had her own particular understanding of operating against the grain of the industrial food system, said yes. She had buttermilk whey she had been composting because she had no better use for it. A fair price, she said, fair meaning above what the composting was worth, which was nothing. By the end of the 30-day window, Beck had commitments from 4 of the 6 names on Elroy's list. Not enough volume to replace the Creamery immediately, enough to bridge if they were careful. He called Marcus on the 14th day. We won't be matching the offer, Beck said. Silence on the other end. Beck, Marcus said, and his voice had a quality in it that might have been genuine. You understand what this means for your operation. Yes, the last delivery under the current contract would be 2 weeks from Friday. I know. He hung up. He sat in the kitchen. Elroy was in the cheese cave. Through the window, Beck could see the whey tank at the fence line, white in the afternoon sun, the pipe from the Creamery running to it along the edge of the property like a thread. 2 weeks. He opened his laptop and sent deposit invoices to the 4 suppliers. He updated the delivery schedule for the cheese accounts. He ordered a used mixing tank from a farm equipment reseller in San Antonio that would let them blend whey from different sources into a consistent feed profile. He thought about what else needed to be done and wrote it on a notepad and then did those things. At 4 o'clock, Elroy came in from the cheese cave and washed his hands at the kitchen sink. He looked over Beck's shoulder at the laptop screen. 4 suppliers confirmed, Beck said. We're short about 30% on volume for the first month. I've adjusted the aging schedule to use inventory we have so we won't miss any restaurant deliveries. Elroy dried his hands. "The Hunsaker woman," he said. "The yogurt place. Petra, yeah. Her buttermilk whey has different chemistry than the Creamery's. Higher acidity. You'll need to test the dilution ratios before applying it to the pasture." Beck looked up from the laptop. He had not thought about the pasture. He had been thinking about feed volume, about supplement profiles, about whether the goats would take to the new sources. He had not thought about the 12 years of soil calibration, the specific chemistry of the Creamery's whey, and what 12 years of that particular chemistry had built in the ground, and what a change in that chemistry might mean for what the ground had become. He had not thought about it because he had not spent 12 years standing in that pasture watching what the ground did. Elroy sat down across from him. "It'll be fine," he said. "Just test it first. The soil will tell you what it needs. You just have to watch." Beck nodded. He wrote it down. The evening settled over the hill country. The goats came in from the pasture, their bells moving through the last light. The brass scale on the table, the 2 pans still, the beam level as it always was, when the weights were right, perfectly, precisely, patiently level. Then Beck's phone rang. He looked at the screen. The number was an Austin area code, not a contact in his phone. He answered because sometimes the new accounts called from personal numbers. "Is this Pruitt Farm?" A woman's voice, clipped, careful. "Yes." "This is Nadine Calloway. I'm Elroy Pruitt's daughter." A pause long enough to contain something. "I heard from someone at the Creamery. They told me what's happening." Another pause. "Is my father all right?" Beck looked across the table at Elroy, who was reading the ledger entry he had made that morning and had not heard the name. "He's okay," Beck said carefully. "Do you want to talk to him?" The silence this time was different, longer, the kind of silence that has been waiting to happen for years and has finally found its moment and does not know what to do with it. "I don't know," Nadine said in the voice of someone being honest in a way that costs them something. "Hold on," Beck said. He put the phone on the table. Elroy looked up from the ledger. Beck said the name. Elroy's face did not change in any way that Beck could identify as change, but his hand holding the mechanical pencil over the ledger page went still. The 2 copper pans of the brass scale hung in the quiet kitchen air. The beam rested level. Everything for just that moment was waiting. Elroy set the mechanical pencil down on the ledger page. He did not set it in the crease the way he always did. He set it flat across the columns the way you set something down when you are not sure you are going to pick it back up. Beck slid the phone across the table. Elroy looked at it for a moment. Then he picked it up and held it to his ear with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something that could break in either direction. Nadine. Whatever she said on the other end, Beck did not hear it. He got up from the table and went outside and stood on the porch in the last of the evening light, looking at the goats settling in the far pasture, at the whey tank, pale against the fence line at the cedar ridge, going dark against a sky that was still faintly orange at its edge. He stayed there for 20 minutes. When he went back inside, Elroy was sitting at the table, with the phone face down in front of him, and the ledger closed. His hands were flat on the cover of it, both of them, the way you hold something you want to keep from moving. "She's coming Saturday," Elroy said. Beck nodded. He sat down. He did not ask what else had been said, because Elroy's face told him that what else had been said was not his, not yet, possibly not ever. Some accounting happens between two people and belongs only to them. He opened his laptop. "I'm going to call Petra Honsacker in the morning," he said. "Get the first Whey sample so we can run the soil test before the Creamery's last delivery." Elroy nodded. "Test plot by stake 7, he said. "The chemistry there is closest to what you'll be introducing. You'll see the result fastest." Beck wrote it down. The next 2 weeks moved with the particular quality of time that is both very full and very quiet, the quality of transition of one thing ending while another is not yet fully begun. The Creamery's final deliveries came on schedule, the familiar pressure in the line, the tank filling in the early morning. Elroy applied the last loads to the pasture with the same attention he had given the first ones in 2006, no more, no less. Beck drove to Petra Hunsacker's operation on a Wednesday and came back with the first sample of her buttermilk whey in a 5-gallon bucket, the same kind Elroy had used 15 years earlier for his first test application. He mixed it at the ratio Elroy had specified, more conservative than the Creamery's chemistry warranted, which was the right instinct when you were beginning something you hadn't tested. He carried it to stake 7 in the west pasture and poured it in the slow arc he had watched his grandfather make hundreds of times. He crouched down and looked at the soil. The soil did not tell him anything immediately. Soil doesn't. That was the whole lesson, though. It took him another week to understand he had learned it. Nadine arrived on a Saturday morning in the second week of August, earlier than she'd said, in a silver Volvo that was dusty from the county road. She was 51 years old and had her father's way of moving, deliberate, unhurried, like someone who has decided in advance how much energy a thing deserves and is allocating it precisely. She stood by the car for a moment, looking at the farm. She had not been here in 11 years. The west pasture was green, dense and particular and unmistakably green in the way that against the late summer hill country reads as almost impossible, the kind of green that stops you because you know in some cellular way that it is not supposed to be there, and yet clearly has been for some time, clearly did not happen by accident. Elroy came out of the barn. They stood 10 feet apart in the morning sun and looked at each other with the careful attention of people who have been carrying a long argument and are no longer certain it matters the way it once did. "The ground changed," Nadine said. "It did." She walked toward the west pasture fence. He walked with her. She was an architect. She read structure load, the way things held together, and the places where they were likely to fail. She looked at the pasture the way she looked at a building, as a design thing, as something that had not happened, but had been made to happen over time by someone who understood what they were doing. She saw the cedar stakes still there, the oldest ones barely visible in grass, so thick it had nearly swallowed them. She looked at the fence line, at the pipe from the Creamery's tank, the tank that would be disconnected on Friday. "You're losing the way," she said. "Found other sources." She turned to look at him. "Beck told me when he called to give me directions." A pause. "He has a list. He's been working it for 2 weeks. He's good at lists. He gets it from somewhere." Elroy looked at the pasture. The goats were in the far section, moving through the morning in their easy, unhurried way. "You said I was making a waste disposal site," he said. "No accusation in it, just the fact." "I was wrong." She said it the way the Pruitt people said difficult things directly, without decoration, with the particular courage of people who have had to be honest in hard terrain for so long that honesty has become a reflex. I looked at what you had, and I saw what it was at the time. I didn't see what it was becoming. Elroy was quiet for a moment. "You're an architect," he said. "You know what a foundation looks like when you're looking at it from above." She turned to him. "Like nothing," she said slowly. "It looks like nothing. It's underground." He nodded. They stood at the fence line in the morning sun, looking at the green pasture, and something that had been load-bearing in its wrongness for 11 years shifted very slightly and let some light through. The following Friday, the Creamery's line ran for the last time. Elroy was at the tank when the pressure dropped and the flow stopped. He stood there for a moment in the early morning, one hand on the pipe, feeling the absence of it. The silence where the low sound of movement had been. The tank 3/4 full, he'd timed the rotation so he'd used the last of the old supply before the new sources came fully online. He did not make a ceremony of it. He closed the valve, walked back to the barn, and started the morning milking. Beck drove to pick up the first full delivery from Petra Hansacker that afternoon. 2 tanks worth in the farm's own containers. Now they'd bought 2 used polytanks from the same San Antonio equipment reseller who'd sold them the mixing unit. Dub Castleberry brought his first Whey equivalent delivery the following Monday in the bed of his pickup in food-grade drums he'd sourced himself without being asked. Beck tested the soil at stake 7 every 3rd day. He kept records. He adjusted the dilution. By the 3rd week of September, the grass response at the test plot was close enough to the historical baseline that Elroy, walking the fence with him in the late afternoon, looked down at it and said, "That'll do. 2 words. From Elroy, the equivalent of a standing ovation." The new suppliers cost money. The old arrangement had not. It was real cost, and Beck was honest about it in the ledger, and with himself he raised their prices across all accounts by 8% in October, with a letter written by Beck reviewed by Elroy, whose only edit was to remove 2 adjectives Beck had included that explained the change in their supply chain and what it meant for the farm's independence and consistency. He expected to lose 1 or 2 accounts. He lost none. 3 chefs wrote back, not to complain, to say they understood and to ask if the farm was stable. He wrote back to each of them by hand on the plain white notepad Elroy kept by the kitchen phone. Yes, he wrote, "We're stable." It was November when he found the page. He was updating the ledger archive, transferring the oldest entries to a digital backup, a project he'd started in the summer and worked on in the evenings when the farm was quiet. He was photographing each page of the first ledger, the one from 2006, and on a page near the back that he had seen before, but read quickly, he stopped. The page was titled the way Elroy titled everything plainly. What didn't work? 2006 to 2008. He had read this page before. He had even photographed it for his phone album, the one labeled Foundation. But he had read it as a record of failures, followed by corrections, the scientific log of an empirical mind. Now, he read it differently. He read it as a portrait of someone who was afraid and did not stop. Every entry on that page was a failure. Some were minor, some the acidification event in the West Pasture's 3rd quadrant in 2007, which had set back 3 acres of improvement by a full season, were significant. And in between the entries in the margins, in the smaller handwriting Elroy used when he was writing something he hadn't planned to write, were the things that didn't make it into the main columns. Clara says, "Quit this." Maybe she's right. Went out at dusk and looked at plot 1. The grass is different. Not quitting. Lost the whole November batch. Sat with it. Made coffee. Started again. County extension agent came by, said the Whey idea won't work long term. Didn't argue. He doesn't live here. Beck sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open under the lamp. It was 9:30 at night. Elroy had gone to bed an hour ago. The brass scale sat in its corner, the 2 pans still, the beam level. He turned to the last entry on the failure page. It was dated October 2008, 2 years into the experiment, written in the small margin hand, "Soil doesn't lie. Just have to listen long enough." He had read this line before. He had thought he understood it. He understood it now in a different way, the way you understand things when you know the fear that produced them. It was not a philosophical observation. It was something a man had written to himself in the dark to keep himself going. It was not wisdom at the end of a journey. It was courage in the middle of one. He sat there for a long time. Then he opened his own ledger, the current one, his third, and turned to a clean page near the back. He picked up the mechanical pencil, the one from the cup on the desk that he had been using for 2 years without registering that it was Elroy's, always Elroy's. He wrote a date. He wrote what didn't work, 2018 to present. He started the list. It took him 40 minutes to fill the page. The failed e-commerce platform from the first version of the website. The delivery he'd gotten wrong on quantities in March of 2019, resulting in a shortfall that had cost him an account he'd had to work 6 months to recover. The dilution error on the Hunsaker Whey in the first test weeks, which had stressed the grass at stake 7 before he'd caught and corrected it. The pricing conversation he'd handled badly with a chef in Comfort who'd left for a competitor and whom Beck had not managed to bring back. He wrote them flat, factual, no drama. At the bottom of the page, in the small margin hand he had apparently inherited without knowing it, he wrote, "The ground comes back if you got the chemistry right. So does everything else." He closed the ledger. The lamp made its small circle on the table. The brass scale in its corner. He looked at it for a while, the 2 pans, the central beam, the way the whole instrument was designed around the premise that balance was not a fixed state, but a continuous active process of adjustment. You didn't set a scale and walk away. You kept adding, kept removing, kept watching the beam to see which way it was tipping and what was needed to bring it home. He went to bed. The check arrived in August of 2022. It was made out to Pruitt Farm, LLC. They had incorporated in January, on the advice of Hallie Dunmore, the attorney above the hardware store, for liability reasons that had seemed abstract until they weren't. The check was from a restaurant group in San Antonio that had become their largest single account earlier that year, a woman named Constance Mirabel, who ran 3 restaurants and had driven out to the farm in March to meet Elroy in person, and had spent 2 hours in the west pasture asking questions that nobody from a restaurant had ever asked before about soil chemistry, about rotation schedules, about what 15 years of a particular input had built in a particular piece of ground. Elroy had answered every question precisely and without impatience, which Constance Mirabel had recognized as the behavior of someone who believes that the work deserves to be understood. She had driven away and sent a letter of intent for a 3-year supply contract the following week. The number on the check was $204,000. Beck set it on the kitchen table. Elroy looked at it. He looked at it the way he looked at soil samples and milk records and ledger entries, with the evaluating attention of someone extracting information. Then he picked up the mechanical pencil and made an entry in the current ledger. Date, amount, source. His hand was steady. The entry took 30 seconds. He closed the ledger. He put the check back on the table. Nadine was there. She had been coming on weekends since August of 2021, driving up from Austin on Friday evenings and leaving Sunday afternoons, quietly becoming part of the farm's rhythm in the way that people do when they finally stop arguing with a place and simply begin to inhabit it. She was learning the cheese cave. She had opinions about the aging process that were occasionally wrong and occasionally right, and Elroy received both kinds with the same steady attention. She looked at the check. She looked at her father. "Bah," she said. Elroy picked up his coffee. "Good year," he said. She laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, the kind that carries something old in it. She looked at Beck, who was grinning in the way of someone who has been holding something back for a while. "He's been tracking for this number since March," Beck said. "He knew it was coming. He just didn't say anything." Elroy drank his coffee. That afternoon, Beck walked the west pasture alone. The hill country was in its early August heat, dry and bright. The kind of afternoon where the sky goes white at the edges and the cedar smells of something almost medicinal, almost sweet, something that is exactly itself and nothing else. The goats were in the shade of the live oaks at the pasture's far end, lying in the companionable way of animals that are not hungry and not afraid. He walked the fence line to the corner where stake 1 had been the first test plot, the 5-gallon bucket, October 2006. The stake was gone, now swallowed years ago by grass that had grown so thick it had simply absorbed the cedar post the way a healthy system absorbs a wound. You could not see where it had been. The ground showed no seam, no interruption, no evidence of origin. It had just become the pasture. He stood there for a while. The grass moved in a small wind that came off the cedar ridge, a shifting and settling the sound of 1,000 thin blades making their small adjustments. The goats' bells from the far end of the pasture, small and clear and unhurried. The smell of warm grass and caliche, and the faint sweet note of the live oak shade. The sky going deeper blue toward the ridge. Everything here had started with a problem someone else couldn't solve. $30,000 a year in disposal costs. Wet souring unwanted whey at the end of a pipe. An old man with a 5-gallon bucket and a library card and a brass scale, and the particular patience of someone who had learned somewhere early and deep that the land does not give up its answer quickly, and that this is not a flaw in the land. Everything here had started with someone else's waste. And what it had become was this grass, so alive it had swallowed its own beginning, ground that remembered every application, every season, every adjustment and correction, and failed batch and early morning, 71 goats whose milk tasted like this specific county in this specific decade. A cheese that a chef in San Antonio had called in a magazine piece Beck had printed and put on the refrigerator with a magnet, an argument that a place can have a flavor if you're willing to wait long enough for the place to tell you what it is. Beck crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the ground. The soil was warm, dark. It held the warmth the way ground does when there's enough organic matter in it, not burning, not dead, but alive in its patient underground way, doing the work that soil does below the threshold of anyone's attention. He held his hand there for a moment, then he stood up and walked back to the house. Elroy was at the kitchen table. The current ledger was open, the brass scale on its corner, the two copper pans catching the late light from the window, the beam resting in its level the way it always rested when the weights were right. Beck sat down across from him. "Stake 7, Beck said. "The Hunsaker chemistry, it's working." Elroy nodded once. "I know," he said. "I checked this morning." Beck looked at the brass scale, at the two pans holding nothing, holding air-balanced, not because they were empty, but because emptiness distributed evenly is also a kind of equilibrium, the beam neither tipping nor straining, just resting in the place it was always trying to reach. He thought about the page in the first ledger, not quitting, started again. Soil doesn't lie. He thought about 15 years of a man carrying a bucket to a fence line in the dark, and the heat and the drought years, and the years when Clara was alive, and the years when she wasn't making his small, careful adjustments, writing them down, watching what the ground told him, trusting the information, even when it came slowly, trusting it, especially when it came slowly. He thought about what it meant to build something that outlasts your understanding of it at the beginning, to put weight on one side of a scale you can't yet read and trust that the beam will find its level even if you're not there to see it stop moving. Outside, the hill country went golden in the late afternoon. The cedar ridge, the live oaks, the green pasture, unreasonably green against the dry summer country, the goats moving in the long light, their bells small and clear and unhurried, the smell of warm grass and aged cheese and old paper, and the coffee Elroy kept on the stove all day, the two copper pans of the brass scale catching the last of the window light, the beam level. And on the table between them, open to a clean page, the new ledger, the one Beck had started in November of the year before the year of the failed batch, and the soil correction and the careful, unheroic work of keeping a system alive through its first real disruption, the mechanical pencil resting in the crease. Elroy looked across the table at his grandson. Then, without speaking, he reached out and moved the pencil to the clean page. Not a gesture, not a symbol, a transfer of a tool to the person who would need it next. Beck picked it up. He put the pencil to the page. He began to write. If you have something in your life that someone else dismissed as worthless a skill, a piece of ground, a way of doing things that doesn't fit any spreadsheet, we'd like to hear about it in the comments below. Sometimes the most valuable things are the ones that haven't been measured yet.